Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Not Your Average Tea Time Podcast. I'm your host, Tabaria. We have a fun one today. I got an interview scheduled for the podcast. It'll be on the second half of the show. The boy T.I., who's a Lions fan, is gracing us with his presence. We talk a little bit about how he became a Lions fan, what's it been like to be a Lions fan throughout their long history of really just not having success, and what he hopes they do at the quarterback position going forward, and a little bit of other stuff. So be sure to stick around after the break before we talk about that. But Peter Schrager released 2.0 of his mock draft, and this one, this is not what he would do, but it's what he's hearing what people will do around the league. So starting off, Trayvon Walker, number 1. That has been picking up a lot of steam around the league, that Trent Baalke thinks that Trayvon Walker can be Aldon Smith 2.0. So that's going to be what he's hearing right now. The decision is far from done, according to Peter. One thing that I think that T.I. would really appreciate if it happened like this is the Lions taking homegrown talent, Aiden Hutchinson, edge defender from the University of Michigan. I think it's going to knock that one out the park. As far as my Jets, they land Kayvon Thibodeau. They really, really need somebody opposite of Carl Lawson and Carl Lawson Insurance, for being quite honest. So I'm really digging that pick. And then Jameson Williams. Jameson Williams at 10 for the Jets. He's still working back from the ACL injury. However, they said that he's ahead of schedule. It's not a career-ending injury like it used to be. If he comes back, then he has the chance to be the number 1 receiver coming out of this draft. If the Jets end up with those 2 picks, I think it's a home run. You address a long-standing issue on the defensive line, and with Carl Lawson coming back after not playing a single snap at all last year, it's like you're getting 2 new defensive ends, and then you take arguably somebody who could be the best wide receiver in this draft. Now I need to do a little bit more work on Jameson Williams before I get my pro comp of him. But one wide receiver they definitely can take is Garrett Wilson out of Ohio State. Now, when I watch Garrett Wilson, I personally see Odell Beckham Jr. The way he's able to make cuts, just be a route technician, and just go up and get the ball and come down with it in all kind of unorthodox ways. I see Odell Beckham Jr. Now, the combine measurements don't necessarily work in my favor with that comp. Garrett Wilson's slightly taller. He's 6 foot. I think OBJ is 5'9", and he's about 10 pounds heavier, so I think. So that comp doesn't work when you look at the combine numbers. When you watch the tape on the field, they play very, very comparable. If the Jets draft ended like this, you can say it's a home run. To really knock it out the park, though, if Derek Stingley Jr. starts to slide to the 15s or somewhere in the 20s, I would love for the Jets to package pick 35 and 38 and maybe a 3rd round next year or something to move up to get Derek Stingley Jr. This guy is cornerback 1 for me, and when I see him, he reminds me of Baby Revis. That 2019 tape was elite. And according to people who looked at the tape across the league from 2020 when he last played, that tape wasn't as bad as people initially thought. So the tape is good. His only concerns is going to be his health. And that checked out from all reports. From his pro day, he ran, he jumped, he did on-field drills, he did everything okay. So ideally, if this is the direction that the Jets actually went during the draft this year, I'd be ecstatic. You lead the first round with Kayvon Thibodeau, Jameson Williams, Derek Stingley Jr. That's 3 starters in day 1. You don't have to play any guessing game in the second round. You get the edge that you've always needed. You get the wide receiver that you tried to trade desperately for. And you get a lockdown corner. And you don't have a bunch of guys back there who just ended up punching above their weight. Before we get to the T.I. interview, we just had some news come through here. Deebo Samuel is reportedly going to request a trade from the 49ers. He was absent from their voluntary workouts. Him, Terry McLaurin, and A.J. Brown. All three of them were absent because they want new contracts. They see these wide receivers getting paid crazy money, and all three of those wide receivers are better than Christian Kirk. So they see that, hey, I'm not going to play this year for less than what I'm worth. And Deebo and A.J. Brown actually has both voiced their displeasure to people and said, hey, if you don't want to pay me, somebody else will. Let's just get this over with. A.J. Brown did it to Twitter. Deebo Samuel told his brother, and his brother's been talking on his behalf on different Facebook posts. So with the draft coming up within 8 days as of this recording, it's going to be really interesting to see if one of those receivers break loose or both of them break loose. The Jets were going to pay Tyreek Hill $25 million. Him and Deebo Samuel are two different players, but one of the numbers that's been thrown out there that Deebo wants is that $25 million per year number. And it looks like the Jets are willing to pay it. And, you got the Robert Saleh connection there. Robert Saleh was the coach of Deebo Samuel, even though there's two different sides of the ball. He was there in San Francisco when Deebo was there, when he was getting his footing under him. So something to watch out for here. But stick around after the break. We're going to have T.I. on and talk a little bit about Lions and what they're going to do in the draft and all that other fun stuff. Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Not Your Average Tea Time podcast. I'm your host, Tabaria, joined by special guest T.I. T.I. is in the building. Yeah, T.I. is asking me some questions about the podcast, Not Your Average Tea Time podcast. And T.I., I don't know if you remember this, but do you remember back at the old USD days that I had a radio station, had a radio program?
I do remember a little bit about that. I never heard your show though, but it does sound familiar that you had a radio show.
Yeah, so two people heard it, and that's only because it was on like Fridays at 10 o'clock. So while everybody else was out at the bars partying, like once a week I go to Al Newharf building, record, go live on air and talk randomly about the New York Jets. I don't know how I had enough content to talk about them for an hour once a week, but somehow I ended up making it work. And from there, I decided to take that name from the actual radio show, carry it over to the podcast, and it's been good. It's been fun here.
That's good to hear.
Everybody, T.I.'s a Lions fan, and T.I., the people wanted to know, I told them I was going to record this podcast with you today. How in the world did you end up a Lions fan?
It's a little bit of a complicated story. So essentially, I've always had a bit of a soft spot for the Lions, even before I became a fan. They were always on Thanksgiving, and I was generally always rooting for them because I knew they were the underdog. Didn't usually turn out well, but I still enjoyed them. Didn't call myself a fan until about 2013, though. But the way I came about becoming a Lions fan is back in high school. I just happened to become a Red Wings fan and was all about Detroit. And it took a couple of years, but that eventually snowballed into liking the Lions as well, partially because you saw them on TV all the time. They're playing against the Vikings and then the Packers and then the Bears, which always seems to be shown in our area. So it was hard not to watch them all the time. And I eventually just caved in, and especially when you got guys like Matt Stafford and Calvin Johnson during that era, they were a lot of fun to watch.
I became a Jets fan for a similar reason. It's like you said, it's complicated, but we're sitting there in Fight Out, and the Vikings took somebody I didn't want them to take. I was a Vikings fan first. And then Jared Allen and Premier, they both said, if you don't support every move that the Vikings make, then you can go and become a Packers fan. And I was like, well, fuck you. Go Pack, go. So I did that for like a day, and I was like, well, I guess I'm a free agent. So I turned on ESPN, and they kept talking about the Jets. Just this, just that, just this, just that. And I was like, well, I think I know my team. ESPN actually talks about them, unlike the Vikings. So I'll just be a Jets fan. And they have literally been trash ever since the moment I decided to be a Jets fan. So other Jets fans, you're welcome. You can blame me for our 10 plus years of misery here.
Well, that's how I know you're a true fan.
Yeah, and so other people want to know what kept you being a Lions fan.
Partially just the hate that I have for the Vikings and Packers. Just I'm born and raised South Dakota. A lot of Vikings fans and a lot of bitter Vikings fans. Even before going to Fidel, the Stenbergs, the Jared Allens, the other Vikings fans in Fidel. I grew up with that stuff in high school. Always had Vikings fans. It's always our week. So just never liked them from the beginning. And joining the Lions Brotherhood just perpetuated that dislike of the Vikings, and I didn't see any specific reason to start liking any other team. And once again, you got a guy like Stafford. You could tell he was giving it his all every week, even if the record at the end of the week, at the end of the season, wasn't the best. You could tell he was just a great player to watch, and there'd be highlights almost every single game. And to some extent, I was always, hey, this year will be different. This year will be different. Matt Patricia's third year, I did not. I knew things weren't going to be different unless he got fired, and I'm glad he got fired once he did.
So,
But with Dan Campbell, it's a brighter looking future with Dan Campbell, I'm thinking.
so you got Matt Patricia out of there, hired Dan Campbell. What were your first impressions of that? Because his first press conference, he was talking about biting people's kneecaps off, and I had to double check to make sure it was a real soundbite. It was, but after his first season, first year of results, that first year, did you expect it to go better than it did, or is this about what you expected, knowing that you traded away Stafford, pretty much gutted the roster, and you got Jared Goff? Like, were the results on the field last year what you expected, or were they?
It was about what I expected. I knew it was going to be a rebuild for Detroit. Also, when you're losing a guy like Stafford and then never really having much of a run game, and then you're sticking somebody in like Goff, it's going to be a rough year. And Dan Campbell is supposed to be a big change in culture from the Matt Patricia era. So, and especially when you have MVP Aaron Rodgers in your division, you got to go up against him twice a year. It's going to be hard to really have a successful first season like that. So I did have low expectations going into the season, and um, looking at just at the record, it's about what you expected it to be. But in contrast, I actually a little more impressed with what I expected, simply because even though the Lions weren't winning very many games, they were in a lot of those games. And Dan Campbell didn't always make the right decision, but his game plans generally were trending in the right direction, especially when you got good rookies like Amon-Ra St. Brown. I
Yeah.
mean, Hawkinson is still doing well as one of the better tight ends in the league. And then the run game's getting better with guys like DeAndre Swift. So I still think there's a bright future for the Lions. And then Goff is there are a couple times I was cursing Goff's name, but his game against the Vikings, I think he redeemed himself. And I don't think he's the future of the franchise, but he's a decent placeholder until we get somebody else in.
So the NFL draft is coming up next week, and next week the Lions have the second overall pick, and they have the last pick in the first round. Do you want them to take a quarterback this year, knowing that
No,
there's a bunch of mid
sorry.
guys, there's a bunch of mid tier guys, and there's no superstars? Or would you rather ride it out with Goff and see what happens next year when the quarterbacks are supposed to be better?
I haven't looked way too much into what quarterbacks are going to be really in the draft this year. I know part of it is I think that quarterback from Pittsburgh is supposed to be pretty good. I forget his name,
Kenny
but
Pickett?
unless he falls to be a pretty late pick, he wouldn't be worth picking up. The Lions, at least in their first round, are going to be focusing on either Hutchinson or Thibodeau, just because they could use a better defensive presence, especially on the edge. So it's still kind of a toss-up. Is it going to be Hutchinson? Is it going to be Thibodeau? Could it be some other defensive player? I do think that's where the needs are. And just looking at a lot of stuff, maybe if there's a good culture change, rather than trying to draft a guy, if free agency is an option, that's how a lot of teams seem to be succeeding. That's certainly how the Rams got a Super Bowl this last year through free agency.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see so the quarterback picks always seem to be such a crapshoot. So it'd be great if they can get somebody like I know San Francisco fans have a lot of hope for someone like Trey Lance, and me being in North Dakota now, there's a lot of Trey Lance fans that are hoping to see him start. But even with college quarterback as successful as he is, you're never really sure how successful he's going to be once he hits the big league. So if you can get someone in free agency later, if once Detroit looks like a more desirable destination for free agents, that might be the better way around it. So I guess to overall answer the question, not looking to really pick up a quarterback this year, maybe next year. Goff might be a placeholder for more than just 2 seasons, but it's obviously going to have to be somebody else in the future.
Yeah, and to your point, Goff showed he can play, especially against that Minnesota game. And that Minnesota game, he showed that when it comes time to play, time to make that big play, he's capable of making it. I think when they beat the Vikings, it was their first win of the season last year. So maybe he is a placeholder for 2 years. Looking back, though, on the Stafford trade, how upset were you that they traded Stafford? Or were you happy to finally see him go somewhere and actually win a Super Bowl?
Yes, I'd much rather see Stafford win a Super Bowl with somebody rather than never win one with Detroit. And just considering his age and his ability at this point, I don't think he was going to really do his best with a rebuild in Detroit. If he had any shot at winning a Super Bowl, it was going to be somewhere else. And considering all he sacrificed and all the years I've been watching him, I was plenty happy to watch him win a Super Bowl this year. I watched just as many Rams games as I did Lions games this year, so I was very happy to see that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were pulling for him because it was a lot of pressure on him. They said once he was finally out of a situation that always had a lot of turmoil in Detroit, can his talent actually shine and deliver in the Super Bowl? And he had a no-look pass to Cooper Kupp. That was vintage Stafford. And Frat Stafford delivered on the promise, got the Rams another Super Bowl. But, all right, T.I., I want to thank you for hopping on the podcast here. We'll definitely have you on again sometime during the season, maybe midway throughout the season, to see how things are going after free agency settles and the first few games are settled in the draft. Hopefully your Lions have surprised some people, just like I hope the Jets surprise some people.
Yeah, let's go Jets.
Yes, go Jets. Let's go Lions, baby.
Yeah, fly high. No, that's Eagles.
Yeah, that's Eagles. It's a whole chant that I'm not going to do right now, but
okay, not a problem.
But hey, thank you everybody for tuning in to this episode of Not Your Average Tea Time. Talk to you next time.
All right, thanks for having me.